Welcome to No Compromises, a peek into the mind of two old web devs who have seen some things. This is Joel.
And this is Aaron.
Testing is a popular topic in the Laravel world. And one of the things I've noticed, especially coming into different projects, and I'm talking specifically about projects that have tests, not the ones that have like zero tests or just example tests.
Yeah, because just to clarify, if there's a library shared on any sort of website, like a news related site, I'll click through and I'll look at a test folder. If the test folder is empty or it just says example test, I don't care what the library is. I'm not going to use it. But anyway, sorry.
I've done that too. Okay, so we're talking about we're onboarded into a project. It does have some tests. What I've observed is that very rarely is there any sort of consistency as to like what is being tested. And let's kind of start at like the feature test level, which is like mainly thinking about how a user would interact with the system through a browser, not the Dusk style test, but like the typical CRUD actions.
It's user input and it's measuring the side effect of that input.
Okay. Yeah. So the way I think about it and kind of the habit or pattern we've settled into is our tests follow a certain structure. And so like the way I think of it is kind of like from the outside of the request in. And so like starting all the way with authentication, like to me, that's the very first thing that'll probably get checked and will either pass or fail. So when we're writing tests, we would write one, maybe more tests that assert like you have to be authenticated or you have to have this role. And if that fails, it should.
Well, those are two separate things. That's authentication and authorization.
Tests. Correct.
Okay.
Right. Two separate tests. But I'm just talking about like the sorts of things to test. Because so often, and maybe I'll generalize here, like a developer will jump right into the happy path of a test, which is great, right? Like you want to make sure the successful path that hopefully the majority of your users will take is well tested. Mm-hmm. But like even in the file, like I'm not looking at a test file, but in my mind, I'm seeing like one of our PHP unit classes, like right at the top, it will be, test fails authorization, test fails authentication, or, like if there's a specific role. And so that's important and it's easy to overlook. And you probably want to have that for all of your authenticated routes, right? I mean, like it seems kind of repetitive or stupid. Like, well, if I have like 100 routes all in one group and they're all using the same middleware, like, should I just check one or two of those? Like we check all of them, right? It's just like you're in the feature file. Maybe you're testing the index method. So yeah, test authorization. Then do it again on the get method. Do it again on the show. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like these are the things that are easy to overlook and may seem stupid, but I would argue it takes like 10 seconds to write a test like that. And down the road, if you refactor your routes file or you add more complexity, like now you have the safety net, right? So that's kind of like the first example. We'll do kind of those auth n. Is that the hip term people use to say authentication and authorization? Aaron's looking at me like I'm crazy.
I don't know. You said hip and cool, and I just immediately turned off.
Your eyes glazed over. But we'll start there, and then generally we'll do like the happy path, like the success. And depending on the complexity of the controller action, there might be a couple, right? Like, so to jump ahead a little bit, if we're creating a record, there may be some optional fields. And so like we'll do one success path with just the bare minimum fields that are required. Then we'll do another success and maybe call it like success with optional that has all of the fields. And if there's interactions between those fields, we'll kind of test some varieties of those interactions, all as part of the happy path. And then this is maybe a little controversial one, but we'll test validation. Like a lot of our tests are.
Well, before we get into that, the other thing is, not only like the optional stuff, but when you get into the actual controller itself, part of the success path is like, are there any if statements in that success path?
Sure.
Or one thing that people often miss is optional or null coalesce. So those don't look like standard if branch, but they are. Because optional, like, using the optional method around something means that you already have two scenarios now that both are successful.
I
So
like
before
that.
we go to validation, it's usually like, success with bare minimum, success with optional added in stuff in the request incoming, and then try to follow the success paths inside the controller. Because a lot of times there's just one, but there could be more though.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I'm purposely not talking about the guts of the test, like, here's what we assert and here's how we do the
Yeah,
setup.
yeah.
Like to me, that's a different topic. This is kind of high level, like what are the things we test? And so,
Mhm.
maybe in a future topic we can drill into some of these in more detail. So, but yeah, good interjection, because I think that's an easy thing to miss when you're you're looking at the code and scanning it for things to test.
Mhm.
But validation, um, you
Which I
know,
don't agree that testing validation is controversial or whatever you just said.
well,
I don't know.
maybe controversial isn't the right word, or it's like too strong of a word, but like overlooked or undervalued, or some people might say, well, you're testing the framework, and we really aren't. Like we sort of are by proxy, but that's not the intention. Like validation is some of your most important business logic, in my view.
Well, with that logic, almost all tests are testing the framework because they use the framework.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
I guess the way I look at it is there's nothing special about your app that requires you to use Laravel to build it.
Hmm.
It just that's the tool that you use. So, like when you talk about solving a problem, you don't think like, well, I could only solve that with Laravel. You think I want to solve a problem and I could use Laravel to do that. So it's the same thing with tests. It just because it's in Laravel doesn't mean that test has to understand what Laravel is. In fact,
Hmm.
we write those tests a lot to not understand what they are. We might use the tools that are available in Laravel, but just because we happen to know in our brains that if you configure validation this way, Laravel's going to use it this way. You don't want
Yeah.
to know that in your tests. You want to
Right.
assume, theoretically. I mean, you wouldn't do this, but theoretically, you could toss out the application layer of something and replace it with a.
Mm.
You could have a Python app and still call the same endpoints, sort of,
Right.
in a test. You wouldn't,
Yeah.
but you could.
No, yeah, I was just like, please don't do that. But yeah, and so maybe I will lie a little bit about what I said before and get into the details just to demonstrate what you're talking about. Like
Mhm.
in a normal HTTP post, if something fails validation, what Laravel will do is send back a redirect, right? So we're not an API, we're like actually in a browser. It's going to redirect back to the page you came from, and in the session, there's going to be like an errors key, and there's going to be fields in that errors key with messages. So
Mhm.
like we don't assert a 302. Like that's a framework implementation detail. And we don't assert, oh, it's a 302 back to the page you came from. Like that's not the important part of the test. I think that would be more testing the framework, right? That
Mhm.
that you're asserting a specific behavior. Now, validation is a little tricky because you do have to rely on some framework implementation details to make a proper assertion. Like if I'm testing that my required validation is working, like we would submit an empty form request or an empty payload and expect that all of the fields that have a rule that says required would come back in that errors key, right?
Yeah.
We are asserting a little bit knowing how Laravel is implementing that.
Mhm.
Um, and we have to go a step further. And I think this is where maybe it's more a little controversial, because like in our case, we assert the message coming back. And the only reason we do that is to make sure that it's like the required validation that failed and not some other rule on that field. It'd be great if Laravel gave us a way to access like the rules that failed, but we don't have that
Mhm.
in the session. So the only thing we
Right.
do have is the message that was returned.
Yeah, if
And
the error key was like first name dot required and then it
yeah,
had like a message or
that'd be
something.
great.
I mean, that'd be really hard to like implement programming wise. So I don't think we're asking for that.
No,
But yeah, that's the reason why. Because otherwise, if you just say, well, there's an error in that field, which one was it? And
yeah,
maybe you have custom a rule class, and it's just not even ever calling that too.
right, exactly. So required is probably not the most interesting rule to talk about because that's pretty straightforward. But when you get into things like required with or exclude if, or like you have these
Hmm.
these interactions, I think those are really valuable tests to have. And kind of like what I was saying about the auth tests earlier. Yeah, maybe it's dumb to write a required test. Like how could you ever get that wrong? But it's very simple to do. Like that test will not take you any time at all to write, and it just gives you some extra confidence, like you didn't forget it, or somebody didn't actually delete it later, or something along those lines.
Yeah, I don't know where this mythical group of programmers is that does everything right, but I
Yeah.
know I've been writing Laravel apps and PHP apps for many years, and I consistently mess things up. And thank you for tests. When you say like required's not that hard, I'm like
Yeah.
I've forgotten required on fields, even though like I put it
Sure.
on the HTML, forgot to put it on the rules for some reason. I don't know what happened.
Hmm. Yeah, that's
That's
a
like the
good
first
one.
thing I go for, and then I
Yeah.
write my test, and I'm like, oh wait, whoops.
Yeah. And I don't necessarily practice this 100% of the time, but if you wanted to experiment with doing like a test driven flow, like you shouldn't write like the idea is you don't write the code until you have a failing test. So
Right.
like I have done it. I don't do it all the time, but it is kind of interesting to like write the failing test, then add the validation rule to make it pass. And sometimes in doing that, I've even been surprised, like, oh, I got something wrong there that I didn't think
Mm-hmm.
that I think, if you would have asked me before, I'm like, yeah, that's really simple. I would never get that wrong. Well, I did. so, so yeah. So, anyways, that's kind of a high level, and we could go into like a lot of other depth. Like if you're interacting with APIs, or if you're queuing up jobs, or you're doing notifications, like those are the guts of what you want to test, and a lot of that stuff would be kind of in that success path that we talked about. But sort of structurally, like a feature test, we group it by the actions, whatever CRUD actions are in that controller. And within each group, like the index or the get or whatever, we have like authorization, then all the happy paths, then a bunch of failure modes, most of which are validation, but some could be other things too.
Mm-hmm.
And it also makes it easy to scan your test file. Like when you're looking for something, they can get big. Well, it's like, yeah, just search for test create. You'll jump right down to that section, or search for like validation, fails validation required. Boom, you can get right to that method. Like it's pretty easy to navigate a file when you have sort of a consistent approach.
I think the last thing I'd add to this, just I don't want to go too much out on a limb here,
Okay.
but is by writing these tests and going so far into things like validation and stuff, it
Mm-hmm.
really helps when tech support or anyone like users come to you and they're like, well, I didn't do this, or it made me enter this, or
Mm-hmm.
the standard messages that users have when you're like, that's I get that that's what you think happened, but that's not true,
Didn't work.
because yeah, well, no, but I mean when they say things that are actually
Right.
wrong, like
Right. Yeah.
it never required me to put in a title, like it sure did. And
Right.
I had the tests run 4 times a day, so I know it absolutely is a required thing. But
Yep.
let's you don't say that to you, sure, but that it will like at least trip you off to look at something different.
Yeah. Yeah. There's multiple benefits of being thorough in your tests.
It amazes me that babies can talk, or like, well, not baby, but like
Yeah.
when
Give me an
children grow up.
age.
I don't know. I don't know when they'll learn to talk. But what the point is, like, I was visiting a friend and I saw her spawn, and it was learning to talk, and everyone was like talking in this high pitched weird voice back at it. They're
Sure.
like,
Yeah.
"Oh, hello." I'm like, isn't that messed up? Like we expect them to learn to talk, but when our first
Mm-hmm.
interactions with them are not how you talk,
Yep.
like people think it's weird when I've talked about this before. When I see a baby, I'm like, "Hey, nice baby." But I also
Mm-hmm.
talk to babies in the same way as I talk to you. Well, hello, baby. How are you doing? How's work? Nope, don't work yet. Okay, and then I walk away. But
Mm-hmm.
my thought process is that I'm teaching them. Actually, I'm teaching them better than their parents. Really,
Yeah.
how to speak.
Mm-hmm. You're right. And I have to go back. Did you say her spawn?
Oh yeah, yeah,
I'm sure parents love hearing their kids talked about that way, but as
yeah.
you were talking about that, the other parallel I see is the way people talk to like puppies, right? And
Yes.
you know what? And that's why puppies grow up to talk that way. And it's really, it could have been different, Aaron.
Well, no, it's just like though, like dogs don't understand. And so when we come and see them, we're like, hello, dog. And they're all excited. And they're like, since they don't understand what we're saying, what they hear is bark, 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 like, because we can't
Ooh.
understand what they're saying. So basically,
Yep.
we bark at them and then they
Yeah.
bark back and we're like, stop barking. Like, poor dog. No wonder dogs sometimes get like all messed up because they're like, well, He barked at me. I barked back, and then he said, "Don't bark." What do you want
So
from me?
confusing.
Yeah.
Well, next time you see a baby, just say, "Who's a good boy?" and like scratch their tummy or something. Or would that be weird?
We're all smart and we can figure stuff out, but maybe you just don't have the time and you're looking for some pros that have done it before and can save you some time and jumpstart their project.
Well, I know two guys that can help. Their names are Joel and Aaron. If you want to talk to us, head over to nocompromises.io and book a free call. See how we can help.